Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. My name is Dr. Jamar Tisby, and I have three other co-hosts, Diana Butler-Bass, Kristen Dumais, Robert P. Jones. We're each scholars, three historians, and one sociologist who write extensively about religion and its intersection with culture, history, and politics in America. We're also deeply faithful Christians, and we take our faith seriously, as well as the future of democracy and Christianity in the U.S. And most importantly, over the years, we found ourselves to be not just fellow travelers, but friends. And that's why we decided to take that friendship and this podcast on the road. We have been doing a series of events called Faith and Democracy Rallies. We held two of them prior to the 2024 presidential election. One was in Greensboro, the other was in Tempe, Arizona, both battleground states. And we talked about the role of people of faith in this democracy and the precariousness of our democracy in these times. Well, we just had our third event, and it was our first live in-person event after the election. We were down in Atlanta. Shout out to St. Luke's Episcopal Church downtown for hosting us in their beautiful church. And we talked about our reaction to the election. And quite honestly, it was a very somber tone. We all felt the weightiness of the moment. We all expressed our concerns over the future of democracy, the protection of voting rights, the ability to have the peaceful transfer of power, and what the incoming administration has already promised that it would do. So all of that was in the room. But there was something else in the room. We had incredible musicians with us, and they gently ushered us in with music that fit the moment and the mood, and they gently ushered us out at the end of the evening. We also did some Q&A with people, but I think the most important part was just being together. You know, the Bible talks about mourning with those who mourn, and I think we felt a bit of that spirit, hundreds of us, but all being in the same room at the same time. We felt the weight of the moment, but being together, we could also share that burden, share that weight. So I don't know the future of these events. If we'll continue to do more in the future, depends on funding and logistics. Believe me, we want to. And if we do, if there's any way at all possible, I encourage you to come to these live in-person recordings for that very reason of community, of being in the same room with like-minded people. I guarantee you will come out more encouraged than when you entered. So here's our conversation at the Faith and Democracy Rally in Atlanta. And remember to subscribe at convocation.substack.com. Hope you appreciate this conversation.
You know, I think there's a big part of me that just thinks I should say amen and let's go home. So we are, here in a church, but we have certainly been to church already tonight. And I can tell you, it is good. I think all of us, through these last weeks and days, we have all said how much it's good for us to be together with each other and how much it is good to be here in this space with you tonight. So thank you for coming out, and we hope we're holding space for all of us to breathe and for all of the things that we've heard. I think it was like a perfect setup for the conversation we're having tonight. So this is the third of these Faith and Democracy Tour meetings that the four of us have had. We had two in October, one at Dayspring United Methodist Church in Tempe, Arizona, one at First Baptist Church in Greensboro, North Carolina, and then here at St. Luke's Episcopal. So we're kind of spreading the denominational love around here. And I should say, just on a personal note, it is good for me to be back home. So I was born here in Atlanta. I was born actually at Emory University Hospital. My daughter was born at Crawford Long around the way, and I came back around after growing up in Mississippi to do my PhD at Emory University. So I'm very happy to be back in Atlanta, where I feel very, very at home here tonight. Just a couple of things. So, we're here. We're obviously in a very different space. than we were in the last 2 times we had this conversation in religious spaces. We're all feeling very different things. I think most of us here that we're and part of what we're doing is kind of an interesting evolution for how we got here. So we're 3 historians, and I'm the sociologist that they let hang out with them and have these conversations. But we found each other, I think, first through our writing and the work that we were done, and kind of through our scholarship. But I think we found also that we're kind of fellow travelers in many other ways, and kind of become friends here. And so part of this is just that outworking of this, and then we've graciously, through a lot of connections, found these amazing new friendships with these musicians that are here and have set the table so beautifully for us tonight. So what have we been up to? I think we've been trying to set a table and trying to hold some space for a different kind of conversation about faith and democracy than the dominant one we have often heard. So it is one, we've been thinking about this, that is about, for example, pluralism instead of Christian nationalism, right? One that is about equality rather than hierarchy, one that's about truth rather than propaganda, and one that is about love and compassion rather than power and fear. So we're trying to hold that space here tonight, and we'll kind of continue that conversation. I do want to say, so we're here in a church, right? So this will be a nonpartisan conversation, but I want to be really clear that this is not going to be a neutral conversation, right? We are here to talk about love and justice and what that requires of us in this moment. Yeah. And it requires more of us than silence and neutrality. So we're going to be very clear about that and the stuff that we're saying about that tonight. I want to draw just a little bit of time back to kind of what we heard from the songs. I was kind of writing phrases down to kind of just bring that back into the room before we kind of open it up here. I don't want to sing about joy today. Kind of the opening, kind of opening up the space for all the stuff that we're feeling. We thought that there was truth enough to save all of us. The dark clouds roll in, but we're still standing. I have a voice. It's a beautiful noise. And we have a choice whether to use that voice. A change is going to come. Listen. And this line from that song, from Sam's song, our children will grow from the seeds that we now sow. So I'm just going to hold on to that, and I'm just going to say a brief word just for me, and then I'm going to turn it over here to Kristen. But the thing that kind of I woke up with earlier this week was kind of 2 lines that I think have kind of held me. One of them is that we are going to have to think about some bright lines to draw. And the other one is also about lines. We're going to have to think about the bottom line. What I mean by that is I kind of look out in the audience here, and I spend a lot of time speaking to predominantly white Christian audiences. And I think it is hard for us, for those of us who grew up in that tradition, to kind of wrap our heads around the kind of discomfort that is going to be required of us to be faithful in the days that are coming. And to kind of hold out that space. And so one of the things I just want to kind of drop out at the beginning here is that I do think we're going to have to do some work of drawing some bright lines ahead of time that say, when we see this, we are loud. When this happens, we will speak up. Because if we don't draw those lines now, what we know from history, what we know from our own history, from others' history, is that that slippery slope is hard to find a place to get a toehold in. But if we set those lines now, so when we see immigrants being rounded up by police and military, and when we hear the word encampments and concentration camps, that has to be a bright line for us, just to name one. where we don't go there. And just to kind of think about, like, it can't happen here kind of language, I went back and looked, I'll stop here. I went back and looked just to kind of remind myself where the country has been. I went back and looked at some public opinion data from 1942. Now, if you remember what was going on in 1942, is that we were rounding up people of German and Japanese and Italian descent, and we were literally putting them in concentration camps and shipping them off to places away from their home. They lost their businesses, their home, all that. I went back and looked, and remember, this was FDR, right? A progressive president that signed this into law. And when I looked at the public opinion date 1942, and it asked how many Americans agreed with this policy, and it first asked about those who were not citizens. 93% of the American public approved of people of Japanese ancestry being removed from their homes in California and sent into the interior into encampments. Even when you asked about people who were citizens, it was a majority saying, yes, we think this is right. And half of those people said even after the war, they should not be allowed to come back home. So that's where we were in 1942. Our last public opinion survey, we're finding 4 in 10 already ahead of the announcement saying that they would support a policy of rounding up and deporting immigrants who are in the country illegally, even if it means setting up encampments guarded by the military. 4 in 10 Americans today, 8 in 10 Republicans. So this is where we are heading. This is just one, right? Not to mention our transgender brothers and sisters, right? Not to mention our Jewish brothers and sisters, not to mention like all kinds of vulnerable people, that particularly those of us who have more security, who have more privilege, are going to have to draw the bright lines to stand out. And the last thing I'll quickly say is that for many of us who have means, it is going to mean that the bottom line, our bottom lines, are going to have to come into play, because these movements are going to need resources to resist those things. So I'm talking about endowments, I'm talking about foundations, I'm talking about that second vacation home. These are things that are have to come into play, because we're going to need the resources, I think, to kind of preserve and protect and kind of live into the kind of country that we want to live in. So let me pass it on to Kristen.
Oof. Here we are. And we're here together to remind each other of what is good and true and beautiful. So I'm a historian, and I'm a Christian, and I've always thought that those two things go really well together. Because what historians do is they tell you how we have gotten to where we are. And historians, we tend not to be the most hopeful bunch. I'm also a Calvinist.
That's the problem.
Right, it gets dark really quickly with me. But that's fine. This is kind of my moment. So history can show us how things came to be to help us understand where we are now, and to help us understand how the world works. Who did what? Who made what choices? Who spoke out? Who stayed quiet? Right? Yeah. That's what history shows us, so we can understand how we got here. Because if we aren't happy with where we are, we need to know what brought us here so we can know what to do differently. There's actually an old Christian virtue that describes this, and it's prudence. Prudence or wisdom, understanding how the world works, understanding what brought us to this point so that we can be wise when we are trying to do what is good and what is true going forward. So we're here to cultivate wisdom and prudence. Now, a bit of a backstory for me. Before I wrote the book, Jesus and John Wayne, I wrote a little essay, and I published it timed to Trump's inauguration, Trump's first inauguration. And that was an essay on evangelical masculinity and militarism. Because the truth was, I had actually started exploring that specific topic long before, back almost 15 years earlier. And I had been researching into what I found to be a kind of shocking but very popular portrayal of what it meant to be a Christian man, to be aggressive, even militant. It was very hierarchical. It was about power over, about a coercive power. And as a person of faith, I thought, wow, this doesn't seem very biblical, even though it was being promoted by Bible-believing Christians. And so I started to explore, where did this come from? And what did it lead to? And then I set that research aside for a number of years. It wasn't until the fall of 2016, in the days after the Access Hollywood tape release, that I brought that research back out again, because everybody was asking, how could white Christians, in particular, white Christians, white evangelicals specifically, support somebody who was so clearly going against all of their values? And I knew that that was the wrong way to frame it, that we didn't accurately understand what some of those core values actually were, right, to our detriment. And so I brought out the old research, and I wrote this essay and published it online, time to Trump's inauguration. And it went viral. It went viral. And I mean, you're not supposed to read the comments, I know. But I did, and I was actually really surprised what I saw there. Over and over again, white Christian men themselves, white evangelical men weighing in, saying, this is exactly right. This is the story of my life. This explains it. And that actually compelled me to write the book that became Jesus and John Wayne. But just a couple of days after that essay published, I got an email from a scholar that I'd never heard of before. And he introduced himself as a scholar of Nazi propaganda. And he asked me if I was aware how similar the quotes that I had pulled and quoted in that essay on evangelical masculinity and militarism, how strikingly similar those quotes were, almost word for word, with the propaganda of the German Christian movement, the church under Nazism. He said, "Did you know?" And I wrote him back that day and said, "Yes, I know. My outside field in graduate school was 20th century German history with a focus on the German Christian movement and the Holocaust. And I have been carrying that burden of knowledge with me of what happens when we idolize power and hierarchy and order, and when we call that cause God's cause." And I knew how dangerous that could be. And I was reminded very recently, as before I pass the baton, about some of my studies in 20th century Germany, and particularly the kind of categorization that scholars use. So, you've got your bad guys, you've got your perpetrators, right? The Nazis, the SS, and so on. And you have your victims, right? Jewish victims and a more diverse group of victims as well. So you've got your perpetrators and your victims. But scholars also talk about a third group, a very large group. And that group is the bystanders.
Right.
The bystanders. Now, when I first heard that concept, I was thinking, oh, they're kind of like apart from, right, at least they're not the perpetrators. But then as I read more and got into the scholarship, I realized, no, it's the bystanders who are the enablers. It's the bystanders who aren't just standing by, right, uninvolved. The bystanders who are not intervening when they ought to, when they must intervene. And the more bystanders who intervene, the safer it is for them and certainly for the victims. The more who intervene early, the earlier they intervene, and with greater power, the less likely it is to result in the horrors that we know from 20th century German history. And so I think this is our moment for us to consider who it is that we're going to be. Are we going to be bystanders? Are we going to be resistors? And what would that look like for each and every one of us to be resistors? And for some of us in this room, what we are called to do will put us in at significant risk. I'll just say it. For some in this room, you can do things to mitigate that risk, right? And it will take all of us to search and to ask what it is that we need to do each and every day. So with that, I'll turn things over to Diana. Diana will bring the hope. She always does.
I was just thinking about the fact that I think this is the first time we've set this flow up. So the Calvinists went first, and I grew up as a Methodist.
You need to fix this.
Before I became an Episcopalian as an adult. Wesley has to come second to correct Calvin.
Yep, go for it.
Bring the strangely warmed heart.
Warmer heart.
There you go. Strangely warmed heart. Oh, gosh. I think that we've just all really had an incredibly difficult couple weeks, and this is just the preparation time. So I don't know that exactly sounds like hope, but it is clarity. And I always find hope around clarity. That if you can be honest about something, if you understand the story that you're living in, if you're not lying about what's going on in the world around you, that there is a kind of hope that can be found. I learned that a lot by working for the last quarter century really, 20 to 25 years, mostly with mainline Protestant congregations. Because one of the things that I know about my own tradition in the mainline is that, I'm really sorry to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, I've certainly said it in print and with friends, is that the mainline in the last couple decades has had a tremendous capacity to deceive itself and not be terribly honest with what was happening around it. And so a big part of my work has been to be in rooms in beautiful buildings like this and to tell people the truth. And that's been very hard. It has not been easy work. Taking it on a lot of chins. There are a lot of places that wouldn't invite me back because I would tell the truth. But there were a lot of places where the response to saying what was true about the world and about the position or the status of the people who I was speaking to in that world was met with a lot of relief. It was like, oh, finally, somebody has said what I always thought was going on. And so I think I learned that in part from being a historian, is that telling a true story in community is often the very thing that needs to happen in order for the door to be kicked open and the Holy Spirit to come blowing in. And so I'm holding on to that over the last couple weeks. Beyond that, I listen a lot because even though I'm trained as a historian, I haven't worked as an academic historian in quite a long time. And most of you who are people who know my work know that I'm primarily a writer. And I write a lot about theology and ethics and the Bible and history and a whole range of things, and how all those different aspects of a life of faith intersect with culture. And that means I listen a lot. I pay a lot of attention to what's happening around me. Writers have the big permission slip to eavesdrop on every conversation they wind up anywhere near. And so if you learn that skill, you hear stuff. And one of the things that I've heard a lot this last couple weeks, and in particular, people in my own world, when they would ask me, what are you doing? What are you planning on doing after the election? I said, well, I think my friends and I are going to keep with these little faith and democracy conversations. And literally somebody said to me about 3 or 4 days ago, oh, I don't know how you can do that. I don't have any faith in democracy. And I went, oh, that's interesting, because the little word we're using is not in, it's and. So we're not using a preposition, we're using a conjunction. There's the writer.
There we go. That's good.
Your English teacher came out there. And so ever since this conversation, I've been thinking about this, how important the little word is that we use between these two other words, faith, democracy. What word do we put in the middle of that? And as I went there, I realized there are a lot of times in American history, these two will be able to affirm it, where people had little or no faith in democracy, or that faith had to serve as a corrective to democracy, or a challenge to democracy. It was a rare time, actually, in American history where faith and democracy sort of walked an easy path together. Usually there's been some tension between these two things, and oftentimes a lot of tension. So I think that that's an important thing for all of us to consider spiritually and historically and theologically, is what word would we use between those two terms right now when we think of faith and when we think of democracy. And I'm struggling to find what my word is at the moment. And so I invite you into my struggle, and please feel free to share with me, because I'll probably write about it.
Jamar.
If we had had this conversation 2 weeks ago, I would have come out and explicitly said that my goal was to encourage you. Not today. I've struggled all week leading up to tonight because I'm coming to you with a tank that's nearly empty. And it's not because of just the past 3 or 4 months and the campaign. It's because I've been black my whole life. And I appreciate the black folks who came out tonight, because you're staying at the table in the midst of what I'm sure is exhaustion. I think right now we need to be paying attention to what black women are saying. Malcolm X said the black woman is the most disrespected person in the nation, and in so many ways he's right. There's a black woman on social media. She's a scholar, a writer, and her name is Brittany Cooper. She goes by Professor Crunk on social media. And I keep coming back to her words. She said, the exhaustion has settled in. The hypervigilance that is black people's perpetual condition is exacerbating the world weariness I already felt. What I feel is tired. While I am very glad that there are organizers who are apocalypse ready, I do not feel ready. We are on the brink of subjecting black folks to the brutality that our ancestors prayed and fought for us never to have to experience again. I am tired. I came here to say that we deserved a victory lap, not a marathon tacked onto us at the 26-mile mark. My tired is tired. And the way she put that you're at the end of a marathon, that you've worked so hard, you're exhausted, you're looking forward to crossing the finish line with a victory. Oh, just kidding. Here's another marathon for you to run. And I know that the white Christians here tonight, you are concerned. You came here, you made time, you made the effort. As a historian and as someone who has done this work of justice in public for more than a decade, it feels like black people have carried America on our shoulders as far as we can, without the help of more than a minority of some white folks. I think that's the exhaustion that a lot of black people are feeling. Not that long ago, we had a whole civil rights movement that was mostly us. There were some exceptions, I know, but it was mostly us. And we bore the brunt of this nation's recalcitrance, its refusal to change. Our churches were burned, our spokespeople were killed, our activists were jailed. And like Brittany said, we're on the brink of experiencing the things that our ancestors fought and prayed that we'd never have to experience again. So I don't have a whole lot of attaboy, attagirl on this evening. I'm deflated, defeated in the sense that I think democracy suffered a defeat. I'm grieving, and I'm also frustrated. And one of my frustrations comes from the fact that as we talk about what to do now, I see white people, again, huddling up with other white people to try to figure this out and completely overlooking the black experience, and particularly the black Christian tradition. So we talked a moment ago about the German church, the confessing church, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's so interesting to me that white people will leap over an ocean and cross continents to find examples of Christians who stood up against injustice.
Yep.
Christians who stood up against a government that was mixing politics and nationalism in its toxic brew. And I'm just like, yo, black Christians been doing this a minute. And maybe, you don't have to look all the way over there. Not that we can't learn from that, but there's something in me that thinks that until white Christians are willing to listen to, learn from, and follow the lead of the black church, that we still haven't dealt with fundamental issues that have undermined democracy ever since the founding of this nation. Because as I wrote in one of my Substack posts, for white Christians to truly look to the black church for leadership, they're going to have to confront why there's a black church in the first place. And that's going to require a whole other kind of confessing church.
I was going to add one quick coda there, Jamar. So, I'm a social scientist and spend all my time sifting and sorting, right, the American populace, and particularly looking at religious demographics. And I was reminded again that when we use the categories that sociologists and political scientists use to describe religion in this country is by race.
Yeah.
Like, we don't just divide people between Catholic and Protestant and Buddhist and Jewish and
Calvinist and Methodist.
or Calvinist and Methodist, right? But the primary sorting mechanisms is by race, ethnicity, and religion. Like, so we distinguish white evangelical Protestants, for example, from African American Protestants, even though nearly 6 in 10 African American Protestants identify as evangelical.
Right.
But we put them in these different categories. And why do we put them in these different categories? Because they behave so differently on the ground. And I'll just drop this last thing here. The 100 years ago, H. Richard Niebuhr wrote this book called The Social Sources of Denominationalism. And many of you in this room may have actually read that book. But in there, he talks about the persistence of the color line in the Christian church. And he calls it a scandal. And this was like a century ago, right? That he writes that this ought to be a scandal in the church. And when I've just been poring over all the exit polls, and there are no two groups that are further apart in their vote choices in this last election than white evangelical Protestants and African American Protestants. There's further distance between them and Jewish Americans. There's further distance between white evangelicals and unaffiliated Americans. They constitute the poles of our discourse. And it is 8 in 10 white evangelicals voted for Trump, and it is over 8 in 10, almost 85% of African American Protestants voted for Harris. Now, we're so used to looking at that divide, I think we don't even blink half the time. We see it, well, of course, that's just what happens. But if we stop and think about, that's a scandal. If we really take that seriously. It's just sort of like mind-boggling that is the case when we share so much geography. We share hymns and theology and the approaches to the Bible. Like, all of that stuff is true. It's just about race and the history of race in this country. And the last little piece of this, just so that we're all clear, I wrote a piece that got published in Time magazine on Monday, and I entitled it, "What White Christians Have Wrought." And the reason why I entitled that is because we all probably, if you pay attention to the news, you know the number, 8 in 10 white evangelicals, every time Trump has been on the ballot, have voted for Trump. No matter what, that's where we are. What I think people don't take in, we're here in an Episcopal Church, the kind of part of the mainline denomination, the non-evangelical Protestant world. But here's the little secret that most people don't know. Diana has spent a lot of time talking about this. 6 in 10 white mainline Protestants have voted for Trump every time he has been on the ballot. 6 in 10 white Catholics have voted for Trump every time he has been on the ballot. And you see the same split there in the Catholic Church. It's not white-black, it's white-Latino, but they are mirror images of one another. Latino Catholics have tended to vote for Harris or Democratic candidates. White Catholics voted for Trump or Republican candidates. That's historically the divide. If you put all white Christians together, it is 2/3 of all white Christians in this country voted for Trump in the last election cycle. There is no other group that looks like that. Christians of color, 2/3 the other way. The unaffiliated, 2/3 the other way. Jewish Americans, 2/3 the other way. Right? Why I call it white, we ought to be clear amid all the slicing and dicing of like who moved where and which vote switched where. We do not end up in the situation we are in without our fellow white Christians putting us there. And that is where the buck stops and starts. And if we're going to get out of this, as Jamar said, we're going to have more than 1 in 3 white Christians saying, I believe in democracy, I believe in equality, I believe in liberty, I believe in the Constitution, and I'm willing to risk something to stand up for it.
So I'm going to present 2 questions to you. They're sort of related. If you want to respond to one more than the other, feel free. How do we communicate and come together across tribes to open space for hearing and being heard? And then the second question you can respond to maybe either. As a current high school teacher, what can I do to create an atmosphere that's a safe place for my students who are Black or LGBTQIA? I worry for them.
Wow.
So for the first question, what can we do to come together and bridge divides? What will not work is coming together to bridge divides.
That's right.
Yeah.
We have to come together over a shared mission, over a shared goal. This is my critique often of intentionally multiracial churches, is they make being racially and ethnically diverse the thing, such that it's almost like they're all in a circle facing each other and looking around and saying, look at how diverse we are. And then what does leadership do? Well, we want to maintain this diversity, so I can't say anything too divisive because this group will be offended or that group will be offended. Rather, I think of a team, whatever sport or club you want to think of. What brings together a team? It's not the fact that we're all different. It's the fact that we have a shared goal. We have a mission. And in order to achieve that mission, we need different people on the team who bring different skills and gifts and talents and perspectives. So I think a lot of times in the church, we want to lift up diversity, we want to lift up harmony and coming together and unity, but we make that the thing, when I think actually the unity across divisions is a byproduct of the mission. So the difference is this: it's not saying, hey, you believe something different than I do, let's have a conversation.
Right.
It's, we want these books in our library. Let's make sure it happens. Oh, you believe that? I believe this. Interesting. Is the book on the shelf? So I don't think it is very effective to try to bridge divides by saying, let's try to bridge divides. I think it's much more effective to bridge divides by saying we have a shared mission and a common goal, and along the way, as we learn about each other, maybe we can come closer together. Maybe.
I think the second question is really related to that as well, obviously, because if we think that the problem is divisiveness or polarization or whatever it is, then we're going to come up with the solution that is not actually going to work. And a lot of people kind of in the world I inhabit in my regular life have been talking about disappointment. Oh my gosh, with so many people who half the country voted one way, half the country voted the other way, everyone was bound to be disappointed. And this actually came up in a sermon that I heard in the last 2 weeks, where the pastor was trying really hard to comfort people around disappointment. This actually does relate to the second question. And when I heard the sermon, I was so disappointed. Because polarization and disappointment are not really the problems. The problems lie elsewhere. And one of the problems is pointed out in that question. And that is, I went to this person who preached the sermon and I said, yeah, I'm certainly disappointed by the vote, but I can handle disappointment. I lost the class secretary election in 11th grade. I know how to handle political disappointment. The thing that is the problem is that people are in danger. Mm-hmm. And that includes gay, lesbian people, as that question said. And this means that people who are in a position to help and people who are in a position to put their own bodies between what is danger and someone who can't protect themselves are going to have to stand in that breach. And so it is going to be very difficult for people like public school teachers or people like pastors, helping professionals, all kinds of folks who understand the level of danger that people are facing in this society. And even if the danger isn't immediate, you could say, oh, that's just, they're imagining it, it won't be so bad. The truth is that those people are currently feeling that. And we need to take that seriously, those feelings of threat and danger that people who have just more recently felt included in the American project are now feeling. And that is just, it echoes Robbie, it echoes what Jamar is saying, is that people who are in a slightly safer position themselves are simply going to have to invest themselves in risk. And whatever shape that means, wherever you are, it would be helpful if you start thinking about what that's going to look like in advance. Not to negatively anticipate, but to realistically think about what people are already feeling, what people are already experiencing, and then to ask yourself, what do I do to alleviate the suffering and the pain and the loss of hope that these people are having? And is there something that I can do if those people are physically endangered? And so I think that these two questions are really closely related, because what they ask us to do is to get it right. And disappointment and division, thinking about polarization or overcoming division, that's the wrong thinking.
I want to say a couple more words to any high school teachers here, or any teachers. First of all, kudos to you all.
Right,
you are amazing.
honestly.
And yeah, you may well find yourself on the front lines here, sooner rather than later.
Right.
And so just a couple of things to consider in this kind of, preparing or imagining what to do. One suggestion might be do exactly what you have always been doing. If you have worked to create a safe and a brave space for your students, keep doing those things. If you have worked to bring in diverse voices into your curriculum, if you have worked to show students the truth about America's past, keep doing it. Keep doing it. Keep teaching what you know to be true, and commit yourself to doing that, whatever comes your way. And that's really important here, because we know that American history is a key battleground.
Yep.
Ideological, political battleground. We know we have the laboratories in a couple of states already, Oklahoma and Texas, and in terms of higher ed, we have an inkling in Florida. We know the changes that are going to be demanded of some folks. Decide if you're going to make those changes or not, and decide if you're going to support people who are going to be asked to make those changes. Right? Stick with what is true. Stick with what you've been doing.
Great. We're going to take two more. Yep.
How does faith have a place in democracy if there's supposed to be a separation of church and state?
I remember George Marsden, we both had the same graduate advisor some years apart. He would always say, yes, there's a separation between church and state, but there's never been a separation between faith and democracy. And I think that that's actually, the institutional separation of church and state is a different thing than thinking that faith and politics in particular have nothing to say to one another, or that it's somehow against the law for people of faith to talk about politics in public places. That's not true.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's not just bringing your faith kind of into your role as a citizen and as one voice of many, although it is that. But I would also say that our constitutional protections are absolutely essential to protecting religious liberty, to protecting your right to believe and to practice your belief. And so often in this Christian nationalist framework, it's depicted that Christianity, by which they mean a very narrow and perhaps twisted version of Christianity, is under siege. And if you are critical in any way of this ideology and the broader agenda, then you are anti-Christian, right? Well, other Christians would beg to disagree. And therefore, these other Christians are often the real threat, because they're a threat to this narrative that if you're against us, you're against Christianity, you're against God, right? And so if you actually look at who are the targets of Christian nationalists, more often than not, it's their fellow Christians who are saying, no, I am a believer.
Yep.
And I am going to stand and put myself between you and more vulnerable populations. Or, no, I will not allow you to take this faith and say this is what it demands, because for me, my Christian faith demands something else entirely, right? So understanding that narrative and remembering that, not accepting the dominant narrative that they're trying to enforce, but always and intentionally disrupting it. And you're doing it to protect authentic religious faith, Christian or otherwise, and to protect people of no particular faith, to push back against this coercion.
So many, especially white Christians, are comfortable living in cognitive dissonance. What is the faithful response to this? How do we maintain relationships while being clear in our belief in right and wrong?
I'll briefly say, when that question about family comes up, I often think about what Jesus said when the disciples came to him and said, your family's looking for you. And Jesus said, who's my family? Who are my mother and sister and brothers? Anyone who does the will of God. Family ties are family ties. These are people close to us. I understand. But also, as was mentioned before, people are in danger. It's not the time to pontificate on a political ideology. Be witnesses. State what you believe is true. Don't tiptoe around it, because I guarantee you they're being bold with what they think is true. And I'll also say this, it may result in broken relationships.
Yep.
Why would we think otherwise? I actually think that so much of that question comes from twisting ourselves in knots by thinking that there's some way to massage it, some way to say it, that's going to build that bridge. Maybe, and I hope so, but maybe not. So have you genuinely faced that possibility that you may not be going to their house anymore, that you may not be spending the holidays with them? Not because you don't like them, not even because you don't love them, but because people's lives are at risk. And by their political choices, they're continuing to put them at risk. So where is that line, the bright line? So I just want to say, this is real. It may not be a happy ending in every situation or circumstance. And I guarantee you, for black folks, there have been a lot of broken relationships because of injustice. And now we're getting more and more people who are starting to feel that. And it's strange and it's new, but it's also part and parcel of what goes along with standing up for justice. And I would just invite us to truly ponder that it may not turn out to have a nice bow on it at the end.
Can I just add one quick thing? I feel like I've spent most of my last decade of my professional life trying to recover from the cognitive dissonance that question talks about. Right, trying to recover. So I grew up as a Southern Baptist, right, in Jackson, Mississippi, for the most part. Born here, but grew up mostly in Jackson. But my people, right, come from Macon, Bibb County, just down the road here. And what I've feel like I've been swimming, like that song that Taylor's saying about trying to find the surface. And you see that light, but it's a little glimmery, and you're I'm not sure if I'm gonna. I feel like I've been trying to swim toward the surface to get a breath, because it is so thick and it is so new for us. Those of us who are identify as white, let's think about this. We had democracy for white people in this country. That's the version of democracy that most white Christian churches baptized and supported. I never forget, the National Council of Churches did a report on religious schools in the South. And they concluded that if you saw the word Christian academy in a private school's name, you could look up the history, but you could take it to the bank that it was formed sometime in the late 60s and early 70s as a segregation academy to protect good white Christian kids from going to school with black folks. So this is a new thing. We don't have centuries of good white Christian theology to get us here. This is something we are going to have to build. So Jamar, I'm going to give you the last word here. Take us home, man.
We always give Jamar the last word.
I'm sorry. This feels like it was a really heavy night, but it's appropriate to the circumstance. And we really are Christians who are pro-democracy. And we want to see people have their rights, and we want to see justice enacted. But we're about to find out, some of you for the first time, what that really requires.
Yeah.
What it really costs. And we have a brief period before the next administration to prepare. One of the best things we can do to prepare is to accept and acknowledge the truth about how difficult this is going to be. MLK, his very last speech, I've been to the mountaintop, he said, we've got some difficult days ahead. But that doesn't matter to me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the mountaintop. And one of my favorite historical heroes, Fannie Lou Hamer, born and raised in the Mississippi Delta, said, I guess if I'd had any sense, I'd realize they could kill me. But it seemed to me like they've been trying to do that a little bit every day for as long as I can remember. So, my friends, what I can testify is that when you follow the journey of justice, you become more like Jesus. You may not win, but you become more empathetic. You may not win, but you become kinder. You may not win, but you develop perseverance. You may not win, but you do have hope. Not a superficial, shallow hope. A hope like Jesus that says, not my will, but your will be done. Thank you for joining us for the Convocation Unscripted at this Faith and Democracy rally. We are not done yet. I am happy to hand it over to the artists to speak to our hearts.